Assalamu alaikum. The self as a conversation. Good morning. Last time we ended with a question. What happens when the self itself is built through communication? What if identity isn't something we bring to a conversation, but something conversation creates? That question takes us out of laboratories and telegraph wires and into something far more intimate, the everyday interactions that quietly construct who we are. Our story here actually begins earlier than Shannon, in the 20s and 30s, at the University of Chicago, with a philosopher and social psychologist named George Herbert Mead. Mead never even published his own theory in a book. His students compiled his lectures posthumously into the 1934 work Mind, Self, and Society. One of those students, Herbert Blumer, coined the term symbolic interactionism in 1937 and turned Mead's ideas into a full psychological framework. Decades later, in the 1950s and 60s, Erving Goffman extended this thinking into what he called the dramaturgical approach, the idea that social life is a kind of theater. Symbolic interactionism makes a radical claim. Humans don't just react to the world. They act toward things based on the meanings those meanings hold, and those meanings are created or are revised through social interaction. Mead proposed that the self isn't something we are born with. Fully formed emerges through a process he called taking the role of the other, imagining how we appear from someone else's perspective, and adjusting our behavior accordingly. Blumer distilled this into three simple premises. We act based on the meaning things have for us. That meaning rises from social interaction, and that meaning is constantly interpreted through an ongoing internal process of thought. Goffman pushed it further with his theatrical metaphor. Every social interaction is a performance. We have a front stage where we present a managed version of ourselves, and a backstage where we drop the act. Communication in this view is not about transmitting fixed information. It's about presenting and negotiating the self. This is a profound theological shift, where Shannon Weaver treated communication as something that happens between fixed individuals. Symbolic interactionism treats society as something built out of countless small interactions, face to face, symbol by symbol. Institutions, roles, even something as large as culture are no longer fixed structures handed down from above. They are continuously produced and reproduced through everyday interaction. A classroom, a workplace, a family dinner, each is a small stage where social order is negotiated, not simply obeyed. This gave rise to an entire tradition of micro-sociology, focused not on grand system, but on the texture of everyday life. Psychologically, this theory is just as radical. It rejects the idea of private, isolated mind that simply received messages. Instead, Mead argued that thought itself is internalized social interaction. We literally think by having an internal conversation, using the same symbols and language we learned from others. This means the psychological and the social can't actually be separated. Your sense of self-esteem, your anxiety in a job interview, your confidence on a first date, all of it is shaped by an ongoing internal negotiation of how you believe others perceive you. This idea planted the seeds of later psychological concepts like self-monitoring, social identity, and impression management. But this framework has its critiques too. It has been accused of focusing so heavily on small-scale, face-to-face interaction that it struggles to explain larger scale social forces, economic systems, institutional power, historical change. Critics from more structural traditions argue that symbolic interactionism can make society look like an endless improvisation, when in face deep inequalities and power structures shape which performances are even possible for a person to give. Goffman's theatrical metaphor has also been challenged. Is social life really just performance, or does that framing risk making all human connections sound cynical and staged, leaving little room for authenticity or sincerity? So why does this matter today? Because social media is quite literally Goffman's front stage and backstage rebuilt in digital form. A curated Instagram profile, a polished LinkedIn bio, a private group chat where people really talk. This is dramaturgy at planetary scale. Every platform is a stage, and every post is a performance of identity. Even the concept of a non-live persona, or the pressure to manage one's personal brand, traces directly back to Goffman's impression management, and Mead's idea that the self is built through imagining how others see us. That's arguably the entire psychological engine behind likes, followers, and algorithmic validation. So we've moved from a message traveling through a wire to a feedback loop between two people, and now to something even deeper, the self, built and rebuilt through the very act of communicating with others. But symbolic interactionism still leaves something out. It tells us how individuals build meaning together, face to face. It says far less about what happens when one voice, a newspaper, a radio station, a television network, speaks to millions and once shaping what an entire society thinks about and talks about. That question belongs to our next chapter, the rise of mass communication theory and the idea that media doesn't just entertain us, it sets the agenda for what we think about. Thank you.